Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Bienvenue, bienvenidos, and welcome to Jubilee 2025 Debt Justice Education Series. I'm Tanya Principe. I'm Kairos's new executive director, or newish. I've been with Kairos for 4 months now. And it is such a pleasure to be here with you and to have the opportunity to learn alongside each of you. Thank you for your commitment to Jubilee, for being here this evening, and for your commitment to Kairos. I think you're in for a very special evening with brilliant, passionate speakers. But before we go too far, some housekeeping notes. I just want to let everyone know that interpretation is available in English, French, and Spanish. Click the interpretation button in the menu, and then select your desired language from the list. L'interprétation est disponible en anglais, français et espagnol. Cliquez sur le bouton Interprétation dans le menu. Sélectionnez la langue souhaitée dans la liste. Haga clic en el botón de interpretación en el menú. Seleccione el idioma que desee de la lista. Is everyone on their right language? All right, then, without further ado, I would like to invite Etienne Eason, a student of creative writing and English literature at Concordia University, and a member of both the Eastern Synod Climate Justice Committee of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada and for the Love of Creation Working Group, to acknowledge the land upon which we gather this evening. Etienne?
Thanks so much, Tanya. Hello everyone. My name is Etienne, and I'd just like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. So today we're gathered to discuss debt justice, which of course is not just about economics or our global financial system or the international law that governs it. Debt justice fundamentally is about all people and all nations being able to live in right relationship with one another in reciprocal and mutually beneficial ways. So when we do this kind of work, it's really important to ground ourselves in the reality that living in right relationship with the indigenous peoples on whose lands we reside on is an ongoing daily commitment. So we acknowledge indigenous peoples' ongoing presence and stewardship of these lands. We acknowledge both the nations with whom we live in treaty relationships, as well as those that host us on their unceded and unsurrendered territory. We acknowledge the importance of listening to Indigenous voices and wisdom as we undertake the work of creation care and redressing ecological debt, while also acknowledging how Indigenous peoples are being disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, especially in the wake of this summer's wildfire season. Speaking for myself, I'm joining you today from Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, which is on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Tiohtià:ke originally means where the group parted ways, which refers to how it was often a gathering place, as it still is today for many nations to come together. I encourage everyone to research and be mindful of whose land you are located on, wherever you find yourself across Turtle Island. So thanks so much.
That was absolutely lovely. Thank you so much, Etienne. I'd now like to invite Paul Hansen to lead us in opening prayer. Paul is a Redemptorist priest, and he's the past chair of the Kairos board, and he is a longtime supporter. We are so glad to have you with us this evening, Paul.
Thank you very much, Tina. Be still, know that I am God. God is love. The one who lives in God, lives in love, lives in God. God, who is love. We gather this evening in your presence. We are very grateful for the gift of life given us by our Mother Nature. We are grateful for our home on planet Earth. The new quantum physics reminds that the basis of all reality is energy, relationality, interconnectedness. and the energy the theologian calls love, that is, of God. We gather tonight in this webinar to appreciate that all life on this planet is interconnected, entangled. We gather because we appreciate that the human species survives and lives on this planet if we realize that all life and reality is very much interconnected. Hence, we struggle to create fair, transparent, and binding international frameworks to create justice for all, we humans and all life on our home planet Earth. Tonight, we cry out that present frameworks are simply not working for all. In fact, some are very destructive. And so we see tonight the urgent need for a fair, transparent, and binding international framework to address the sovereign debt crisis, one that places human rights and ecological justice at the center. God, the human family, Mother Earth, and all of creation cries out to you because our future as the human species and life on our planet is in play. We survive as one in love, or we don't survive at all. And so may our discussion tonight, done in a spirit of love all that lives, may it be for us the power and energy, and may we call it a love that will prevail. We ask this in the name of leaders who try to live us and lead us in the family of faith, journeying in the presence of our God, who is love. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for that, Paul. And in that, well, not in that spirit, but I do need to go over a few housekeeping notes. I wish it was following up in that spirit. Just a few things to help our session run smoothly. To minimize background noise, we've muted participant microphones. If you have thoughts or reflections you'd like to share, please do so in the chat box. If you have questions for our speakers, please also add them in the chat. We will have time for a question and answer near the end of today's session. Also important to note is that today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Kairos website and by email to all who have registered this evening. We will also be sharing presentation materials from our speakers on those same platforms. And now let us begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in our series. Over the past two webinars, we have explored the global debt crisis and the concept of ecological debt, two interconnected challenges that reveal deep inequities in the current international system. Tonight, we're turning to a critical question. How do we build the fair and transparent rules the world urgently needs to address debt sovereignty? This evening's discussion focuses on the case for a UN framework convention on sovereign debt, a framework that would establish just, predictable, and transparent processes for addressing the sovereign debt crisis. We have countries to recover, to invest in climate resilience and social well-being, and to chart their own development paths without being trapped in cycles of dependency. Now, in recent years, very recently, many of us, myself included, have questioned the value of multilateralism. It has been weakened, eroded by rising nationalism, unequal power structures, and a retreat from collective responsibility. Yet, as we will hear tonight, true multilateralism still holds transformative potential when it's grounded in fairness and equality. The global debt crisis cannot and should not be managed by debt debtor nations alone. It demands shared accountability, new international norms, and courageous political leadership. Our very special speakers this evening are Daniela Berdeja, who's a debt analyst and manager of the Atlas of Vulnerabilities in Latin America and the Caribbean, Latin DAD, and Anita Thomas, chair of the NGO Committee for Financing for Development. I think they will both make very compelling cases for why such a UN convention is both necessary and achievable. They will examine how current mechanisms fail to deliver justice for indebted nations and how a rules-based participatory framework could rebalance the scales. As I said earlier, I think you're in for a real treat. As participants, your role, my role as well, our roles are vital. Let's listen critically. Let's reflect on the implications for Canada's foreign and financial policies, and consider how we, as citizens, advocates, and communities of faith, can push Canada to lead in advancing fair and transparent global rules for debt restructuring. After Daniela and Anita's presentations, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have a moderated Q&A, and then we'll wrap up with some announcements and ways for you to continue to support the Jubilee campaign. So, Daniela, a little bit about our wonderful speaker. Daniela Berdeja Ruiz is a Bolivian economist and engineer. She has experience in financing and sovereign debt policies, including links to economic and sustainable development. Currently, she serves as a sovereign debt analyst and coordinator of the Latin American and Caribbean Vulnerability Atlas at the Latin American Network for Economic, Social, and Climate Justice, Latin DAD. Daniela, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tania. Hello,
Muchas
everyone.
gracias.
It's a real pleasure for me to be here and share this space with all of you. I will turn now to Spanish to be more fluent and eloquent, I think, to share all the technical topics I want to share with you today. I also want to thank for the wonderful words at the beginning of this webinar. They are very inspiring for me. So, turning to Spanish, comparto.
I will be sharing my slides, my
My
presentation.
Completa. ¿Ahí está bien?
Can
Está
everybody see it? Yes.
Bueno, me
So
gustaría
I would like to
dividir la presentación en tres
divide
grandes,
this into three major parts.
Por un lado, el
For one
contexto.
text, I'm going to talk
Por
about
otra
the
parte,
context.
señalar
On the other
algunas
part,
deficiencias,
talk about some of the
quizás, de la
deficiencies
arquitectura
of
financiera
the financial
en términos de los
architecture
desarrollos más
in
recientes,
terms of the more recent
sin dejar
developments,
de lado las
without leaving
consideraciones
aside
estructurales, históricas y de
structural,
fondo de los problemas,
historical
y
structural
posteriormente
issues,
entrar al tema
and
que hoy
then
nos
going to the
reúne,
subject for
que es la
today,
Convención
which
Marco
is
sobre la deuda soberana.
a framework
Entonces, comenzando con el contexto,
convention.
quizás
So starting with the
algunas
concept,
cosas ya
there
las
are
han
some
visto en
things
los
you've already
anteriores
seen in the
webinars,
previous webinars,
pero algunos
but
highlights que me
there's some of the
gustaría.
highlights that I would like to share with you.
En cuanto a la
In
deuda
terms
pública,
of the public
sí ha
debt,
habido un aumento
yes, there's been
más
an
pronunciado
increase,
después de
which
la
is
pandemia,
since the pandemic,
aunque quizás hoy
and
el
even
aumento
though
es
it
menor,
is, it's not
los
as much of
niveles
an increase,
a
but the
nivel general son
levels
muy elevados
are
y
very
de
high,
hecho
in generally
alcanzan en
speaking,
algunos casos
and in some cases,
niveles históricos,
they come to
y
historical
no tiene
levels.
que ver
And
únicamente
this
con
is
la
not
deuda
only
externa,
because
que a
of the
veces es el foco
external
de
debt,
análisis, sino
which is
también
one
con
of
la
the only
deuda
one that people
interna,
see, but
que ha
also
crecido
the
mucho en los
internal
países del
debt,
sur.
which has increased a lot in the
Sin
countries of the
embargo,
global
quizás
south.
el desafío más
However,
urgente para
perhaps
los
the
países
major
a día de hoy
challenge
tiene
for
que
the
ver
countries
con
today
las dificultades en
is
un
the
contexto financiero
difficulty
más adverso,
of a more
que
adverse
implica, entre otras
financial
cosas,
context, which
altas
is,
tasas
among
de
other
interés,
things,
es decir,
with
mayores
high
costos
interest
para poder
rates,
acceder a
higher
financiamiento,
costs for financing,
y que se ha traducido en
and
un
this has led
efecto de
to
desplazamiento del gasto
the
esencial en
fact
otras
of
necesidades, que lo voy a mostrar más
the
adelante.
costs on basic
Además de
needs,
otro tipo de
which I was showing,
deudas que a
another
veces
type of debt,
permanecen ocultas,
which
como
sometimes
son
are
los
hidden,
pasivos contingentes
which
o alguna carga de deuda
contingent
que es generada
or some
por las asociaciones público-privadas.
some that comes from associations between private and public sectors. And it's important to mention there's a differentiation between countries with high and medium incomes, a basis of an index, which is the personal income in a country, in this, which is defined the access to financing in the best conditions for many countries, but that at the same time hides a series of vulnerabilities that are economical, social, climate, related to climate and the environment, which these countries face when they make decisions on public policy. Today, in this context of higher debt and the higher cost of the debt, and with more complex scenarios, the benefit of the debt negotiations that have continued always be in the favor of the creditors. I'm going to come back to this point before, which is the common framework, which is the only thing that exists, the G20 common framework, which is the only structure that gives any type of framework to resolve debt conflicts, of which it has a lot of faults, and it has not been able to deliver favorable and concrete results for the indebted countries. Another thing that is important in the context is what we're talking about, the vulnerabilities. And here, the ecological debt is very important, and the climate debt and the historical debt of the north towards the south, which not only needs to be recognized, but it needs to be incorporated in the decisions for world economic and social. There is a key role in all of this with international financial institutions, along with the credit rating agencies. So we have to evaluate critically the role that they play today. When we're looking at a high level of debt and reduced fiscal spaces, and so that there's only a unique response from the Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which is fiscal adjustments to reduce spending, and at the same time, but it has social effects, but with the tendency to deepen dependency on the extraction of natural resources, and this is in order to increase exports, and so that we're able to stop the external debt. There's some studies that have for countries of the Amazon basin, and so there's a dynamic which we have seen, which is becoming more complicated in terms of different subjects, particularly for countries of the global south. There's also this sophisticated financial instruments, which are commodification and the financialization throughout the world, but with benefits for new debts for the major investors or world corporations. We can't not mention tax evasion, tax benefits, and so that are weekly, and there's a struggle against financial flows, and so there's been a response to the austerity that the fiscal adjustments can lead to. Summing up all of these points, the only thing that they have as a result is an impact on rights and widening of gaps and increasing the inequality of the level of poverty and also the equality between countries and within countries. There's some dates, very briefly. The debt service overall, so they pay back, and the amortization of capital plus the interest payments. This one absorbs 45% of budget revenue and 35% of spending across the global south. This exceeds total spending by 20%, the combined cost of education, health, and social protection. And so that we can see that this is a debt crisis and of this development at the same time, to add to the climate and environmental crisis. What I was saying, the high costs today, if we look at the interest payments, only 3.4 to 4 billion people even pay more in interest than for education. And this is 3.4 billion. So they're very, very far from the SDGs. If comparatively speaking, in the last years, we have seen that if we compare what comes from the debt and what we pay for the debt from 2019, there's an exit of resources instead of interest. So the flow is negative. So what happens with the current architecture of global debt? We have to say debt is a political issue. It's a power relationship between creditors and debitors, but also between the global north and global south, between the richer countries and those that are not as rich. And here we once again, we all have this background of the origin and the dynamics of the poverty and the emergence of that. That's where we're saying we have to be recognized and has to be incorporated into common decency with a sense of justice. We're not looking for solidarity or help. We're looking for simply that things be more just. The world. I was talking about the common framework, and this is from the G20, and it is handled by the World Bank and the IMF. And so that there's the countries that have major problems in this framework. If we compare the countries, those that have restructured their debt outside of the framework, there is no experience to let us know whether this offers any kind of solution for the common current problems of the debt. And the relief for the debt has been too reduced. And if we look at the budget today, there's still too much money that goes to servicing the debt, even without the restructuring, even after the restructuring. So this is something that is designed to take care of the country's real needs. It doesn't seem to be the case. There's a phrase in English that I think that applies very well to this process. Too little, too late. And so that this is a process which is very expensive, and that this is why it's rather to be in default with their population rather than with their creditors. And so that this situation, this is it's an uncertain process. So I think that this is one of the major problems of the debt crisis today, and always the fragmented focus. It's ad hoc. There's not enough organization in terms of the creditors, and so that to be, since the creditor is the arbitrator, there's no guarantee for the independence of this framework. One of the central problems that we would like to retrieve with the convention. We also need to debt relief is necessary. We are living with a crisis. I was saying, the Secretary of Banca, we have multiple crises, and that we're trying to normalize, and we're getting used to living with them, and that shouldn't be the case. But with these multiple crises, we need immediate or urgent measures to reduce the debt, but at the same time, systemic changes. We need to reform the financial architecture that today has been designed for a very few, and that these decisions are made in favor of these few. So the reforms have to go. And the last point, with the democratization of the world economic structure. And this is a very important role to play for multilateralism, which is, and just to remind you, the pillars of the Jubilee debt campaign that follow along this, and stop the debt crisis now, but with reforms to avoid crisis. And after What's that I was saying before? Yes, the debt was reduced, but 20 years later, we're once again with a debt crisis, which seems to be quite considerably worse. And what we want today is that the lessons learned to reduce the debt, but with base forms at the base. And so that I'm taking up a little too long, so I wanted to answer little questions. Why do we need a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt? Which I wanted to go into the details, but I'd like to leave you with the idea that we need changes at two levels. One is democratization of financing of debt, how decisions are reached, because these are world decisions that affect all countries more to a greater or lesser degree, but at the hands of very few. And that the countries of the global south, which are those of the most effect, son los que less, they have the least voice and the less vote. And so the World Bank has what $1 is one vote, and the United Nations is one country, one vote. And so this is, we ask, we go away from a system based on the creditors to a system where everybody has the possibility of participating in decision making. So te voy a estar en la siguiente, in the next slide. I'd like to come into the subject of today, which is UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. The beginning of the 2000s, the work on debt have asked for many reforms, which up until today, none of them have really gone forward in any decisive way. And perhaps this we can then ask in the financial structure as a puzzle put together by different interrelationships. Sometimes we're talking about what reforming one part or another part, and I think that the proposal which has come forward in the last few years, thinking about the Conference on Financing for Development, it has to become into an integrated framework to simultaneously deal with all of the different reforms, but within a process that may be democratic, just, and equitable. So I'm going to talk about the framework. This is a process. At the same time, it's a framework that should be binding for the different labors. And so that we take the decisions on how we want to reform the architecture. Where do we want to go? And so that we know that they need to be reformed, but now we have to decide in how to do this, what form we would like to give this, how we want to configure them, what are the objectives.
Esa es la Convención Marco. Hoy no tenemos un marco de reglas claras sobre las cuales
Today, we do not have a framework, a clear framework as to how to act. And that is the purpose, to have a consensus of the structures and processes that would define this architecture of debt, considering the whole cycle of the debt, not only renegotiation or crisis, but from the moment when the debt is contracted, when it's used and it's refunded. Now, I am going to provide you with the most important points. The convention has others, but these ones are the ones that I think are more critical for the deliberations on reform. What we ask, what we demand, is to have an agreement on the establishment of a permanent framework that's multilateral, sovereign debt resolution mechanism at the UN. It should ensure the primacy of human rights based on norms and standards, so that when a country wants to restructure or do something with the debt, there is a clear framework. I am going to give you an analogy. I don't like it very much, but it gives you the example. When a company is bankrupt, in some countries, there are some rules that the company has to follow. If we think about it as a country with important needs of the population, but with a lot of difficulties especially fiscal difficulties, there is no rule, there are no rules, there's no framework. So that is what we demand, and we want it to be binding, and we want to have it from the US. Why? As I said, the IMF is a creditor and it's judge, and we need someone who is independent to facilitate the negotiation of the countries and their creditors, so that we could have more ordered, fair, and transparent processes with durable solutions. We have made some progress with this, but we also have a mechanism that's automatic debt service cancellation, so that when there's an extreme problem, climate, economic, health problem, the countries can stop the payment so they can have some relief, so they can invest in their recovery and then go back to payments again. It is very, very important to talk about responsibility, and the deliberations in international fora tend to place responsibility on the country, country with the debt. But there's also responsibility on the people or the organizations that provide that money, that lend that money. Those are the binding, responsible, sovereign, leading, and borrowing principles, and they will be discussed. But we need more. We need them to be binding rules, and we need to be implemented, because we can have all the best principles, but if they cannot be implemented, they are not useful. I'm almost done. New approach to debt sustainability framework and analysis. This is very important because these frameworks define how much debt has to be relieved or renegotiated. And at the same time, they promote austerity policies of the countries, as in the IMF. So, to be very concrete, they promote a prioritization. So the idea is that these new scopes or models consider human rights, gender, climate, development considerations, so they are integral, and that they are carried out by independent organizations, maybe the IMF, but we also need to have an independent organization surveying it. Debt transparency, that's important with the whole cycle, not only with the data, but also with the agreements during the contraction of the debt, and the regulation of the financial system that cannot be put aside. With this, I finish. I think that what we need is a financial architecture or a system that prioritizes life before capital. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. That was wonderful and very insightful. Yes, a system that prioritizes people and planet before capital. We've heard a lot. There was a lot of information, excellent information in that presentation. We are going to take 5 minutes to just pause and reflect, and maybe walk away from our computers, grab a glass of water, and reconvene. So let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and hear Anita speak. Thank you again, Daniela. And for those who are still at their computers, Cheryl is giving us a few things to think about. She's written them in the chat, so feel free to take a peek. One more minute and we'll have Anita. I'll introduce Anita and we'll have Anita speak. All right, I hope you all have some water and some snacks. And without further ado, I am going to introduce our next speaker, Anita Thomas. We are honored to welcome Anita Thomas, who is the chair of the NGO Committee on Financing for Development. In this role, Anita provides strategic leadership and serves as the committee's spokesperson, advancing advocacy with UN agencies and member states to promote fair and sustainable financing for development. Anita is also the main UN representative for Women First International Fund, which supports the economic empowerment of women and girls worldwide. With more than 20 years of experience in international advocacy, finance, and organizational leadership, Anita has been instrumental in shaping global coalitions, including founding the NGO Coalition to End Violence and Harassment in the World of Work under the ILO framework. She's a frequent moderator and speaker at UN forums, and she continues to drive global dialogue on development financing, decent work, and gender equality. Anita also holds graduate degrees in finance, public policy, and economics, and is a fellow of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tanya, for that kind introduction and for inviting me to this important conversation today as I make a case for multilateralism in the space of UN Framework Convention on Debt. We meet at a time of profound imbalance. The world's poorest countries now spend 5 times more on servicing debt than on climate adaptation. Even middle-income countries, once thought resilient, are slipping into distress. This is not just a technical issue or a technical crisis, it is a moral crisis. Because the current debt system as it stands is not only unsustainable, it is unjust. But injustice in finance is not inevitable. It is a design choice. And what we design, we can redesign. That redesign towards fairness, transparency, and shared responsibility is only possible through multilateralism. Today, I want to reflect on what multilateralism truly means, how it has evolved through history, and how it can guide us towards a fair and binding international framework for sovereign debt, one that serves the common good, not narrow interests. Next slide, please. What multilateralism really means. What does it really mean? There are several definitions online, but at its core, multilateralism is cooperation among 3 or 4 or more states based on shared rules and institutions. It's just not diplomacy. It's a decision to bind ourselves to common principles so that no single actor dominates the system. Next slide, please. So the historical impacts, the history on multilateralism, I thought might be good for us to have a general understanding of what the historical milestones in multilateralism are. At its core, multilateralism is cooperation, as I mentioned already, between 3 or more states on shared rules and institutions. Post-war origins, multilateralism as a peace project. After 2 devastating world wars, humanity learned that peace required shared institutions. The United Nations, created in 1945, became the cornerstone of that vision, built on sovereign equality and collective security. A year earlier, at Bretton Woods, 1944, the world established the IMF and the World Bank to bring economic cooperation and financial sustainability. Now, predating all these processes is 2 UN agencies that are stellar examples of multilateralism to this date at the UN, and they are 1, the International Telecommunication Union, which was established in 1865 to standardize telegraph networks. Now it helps with governance for radio frequencies, satellites, the internet, and more recently, the AI movement that we are seeing across the globe. Secondly, the International Labour Organization. It was founded in 1919 to promote workers' rights, encourage decent employment opportunities, enhance social protection, and strengthen dialogue on work-related issues. I'm sharing this just to give a perspective of how multilateralism functions in the UN space. Now, coming forward in 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, now the World Trade Organization, ensured that rules, not rivalry, governed trade. In that same era, multilateralism meant peace through predictability, order through cooperation. As we move forward, by the 1960s, as nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America gained independence, the United Nations changed forever. New voices demanded economic justice, not just political equality. The creation of UNCTAD in 1964 and the rise of Group of 77 gave the Global South a platform to speak collectively. Multilateralism in this context expanded from peace project to justice project, a way for smaller nations to speak with collective power. Moving forward, in the 1990s and 2000s, the scope of multilateralism widens once again to address planetary challenges. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was established in 1992, taught us that no nation could face climate change alone. The WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in 2003 proved that even powerful industries could be held accountable to public health. And then the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, which became later the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, turned moral ideals into measurable commitments. Each of these milestones deepen the principles that collective problems demand collective governance. In 1999, after the Asian financial crisis, the G20 was created to bring emerging economies into global economic decision-making. It was a new form of multilateralism, broader, faster, more flexible, yet still informal and voluntary, lacking the binding of the UN. Now, today is the moment of multilateral renewal. We now face what they call a crisis of multilateralism, growing nationalism, fragmentation, and loss of trust. But global problems, debt, climate pandemic, are by nature multilateral. They do not respect borders. They require cooperation, not competition. Each time humanity has faced crisis, institutions of cooperation have been renewed. Today, sovereign debt is the crisis. And once again, the United Nations can lead through Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt to make fairness rule, not a request. At the FFD, the most recent Financing for Development conference that was held in Sevilla, Spain, FFD4, the outcome document, the Compromiso de Sevilla, reaffirmed that multilateralism matters, that the global financial architecture must become more inclusive, representative, and equitable. It recognized that true multilateralism must give voice to debtor countries, convene diverse actors, and frame borrowing and lending under shared rules and norms. While the document did not accept every reform on offer, which civil society was not happy with, it marked a clear moment of renewed commitment to cooperative governance of development finance. Now the problem, next slide, please. Slide 4, yes. So why does multilateralism matter now? Let's be honest, the global debt architecture is broken. Record debt levels across global south, fragmented credit-driven architecture, no universal rules for restructuring. But then again, how does it translate? Rising debt payments hinder critical social investments. We heard with the earlier speakers talking about austerity measures that is being recommended when the country is asked to balance its budget, right? And how is that happening? How is it translating to people on the ground? And that's very important for us to understand, whether it's a developing country or a developed country. How does financial challenges translate to people on the ground? Yesterday, when I was speaking to somebody, we were talking, one of our members of the NGO Committee on Financing for Development, they were mentioning to us about the lack of infrastructure in certain poor parts of Canada. The same happens in the United States. The people who live in the most marginalized communities are left behind. So you can imagine how that is translating to a country that does not have infrastructure in place, does not have the resources to make investments in these infrastructures. We hear a lot of global conversations about AI, digital public infrastructure. But when a community does not have access to electricity, how are we going to talk about digital public infrastructure? How are we talking about financial inclusion? How are we talking about digital inclusion? In order for a country to make those investments to ensure digital public infrastructure is available, it needs to address its financial challenges. And sovereign debt is not going to help in that regard. Some of the experience, the NGO Committee on Financing for Development had conducted a survey during the height of COVID-19. We did a survey in 7 countries, 7 developing countries, to understand how, from the lens of social protection, climate finance, financial and digital inclusion, how has it translated to the ground, to people? We learned that countries that had invested in infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, were better positioned to ensure cash transfers to their community members, to their citizens. So it is the countries that had the resources, they invested in those structures, right? The countries that didn't have those resources did not invest. So we are in that same situation right now. When a country is focusing heavily on paying off its debt, how is it going to be investing in social support mechanisms, social development? So it is very important that for us to take these into consideration when we talk about how debt translates to people, and really moving with the feet. That is what citizens can do. Really get informed, really start advocating with your member states. Understand what your member states are committing to at the UN, right? And then bring it to your senators, your legislators, so this argument can be carried all the way through. So I would say that multilateralism fosters collaboration for effective solutions. It is very important because everybody has to be at the table. Increasingly, the private sector is engaging in the space as private creditors, and they need to be at the table, not as funders, but should be held accountable for the actions they are taking. So that is let me go to the next slide, the problem with the current system. The current system is there are no common rules for resolving sovereign debt crisis. Restructurings are ad hoc, opaque, and driven by creditor leverage, not development needs. The G20 framework, as Daniela mentioned earlier, was a start, but only 4 countries have used it. Private creditors who now hold a major share of developing country debt are not compelled to participate. And the IMF and the World Bank, while crucial, are also creditors themselves. So the result, nations spend more on debt service than on health, education, or climate resilience. Our financial architecture has no anchor in justice and no compass in sustainability. A UN Framework Convention on sovereign debt would provide both. Next slide, please. Role of multilateralism in debt governance. It creates norms for effective cooperation, essential framework and resources to enhance technical infrastructure. For instance, when this framework is adopted, it puts in motion a series of actions, series of resource investments that would actually help the countries that are heavily challenged with digital public infrastructure. Because this norm setting, this form of monitoring, this form of accountability, where all actors come to table, ensures that there's going to be mechanisms that are being put in place to ensure monitoring and implementation and reporting happens. Daniela spoke about the importance of implementation. Implementation, adopting the convention itself, the framework is one thing, but actually implementing on the ground is another. So if the countries do not have the resources, do not have the capacity, the digital public infrastructure, it just cannot be implemented the way that can generate effective action. So, and then fair burden sharing and global solidarity, a sense of collective responsibility. We are responsible for each other's actions. We are all one unit. At the end of it, I mean, you will see that with the current tariff discussions that are happening across the globe, the impact of that on consumer goods, the price that the consumers are going to be paying. You would see that you're seeing that in Canada. We're seeing that in the United States, where the impact of tariff on the day-to-day requirements for our survival, for our sustainability, whether it's buying technical support system, whether it's buying grocery, whether it's buying educational system, we see how it's translating, right, to the citizens. So it's very important that we look at it not only from a macro level, we look at it how that translates to people and make that call when you meet with your legislators, when you are advocating for this framework. Next slide, please. And then why does multilateralism work? First, multilateralism ensures legitimacy and inclusivity. Every country has a seat at the table, regardless of their sovereign debt situation, regardless of how strong they are, regardless of whether they're from the north or south, everybody has a seat at the table. Second, it promotes predictability and speed with clear rules for standstills, transparency, and comparable treatment. Third, it guarantees fairness, balancing between creditors and debtors, and fairness today must extend beyond states. The private sector now holds nearly half of developing country debt. Their participation is no longer optional, it's essential. You can hold private sector accountable because everybody is tracking the ESG, the environmental social governance metrics. So it's important to make sure that we are tied into this process, just not purely from a narrow perspective addressing debt, but how does it translate to multiple sectors, impact on gender, impact on poverty, impact on social development, and really, and then frame that thought process around that. Fourth, it ensures moral coherence with the SDGs, aligning debt justice with our shared goals for poverty reduction, equality, and climate action. Fifth, it builds systemic stability, reducing contagion and uncertainty. And finally, multilateralism turns debt restructuring from a tug of war into partnership, from a contest of strength into a shared act of stewardship. Next slide, please. Now, lessons from UN framework conventions. There are excellent examples of framework UN conventions, as I already mentioned, on climate action, health initiatives, and land conservation. Next slide, please. A UN framework convention on sovereign debt could be guided by 5 principles: responsible lending and borrowing, transparency and data sharing, human rights and sustainability at the center, predictable mechanisms for standstills and restructuring, ongoing governance through annual COP-style meetings. It would include global debt registry to record all sovereign obligations, prevent hidden loans, and enhance trust. It would also connect debt with climate finance, tax cooperation, and development planning. Like the UNFCCC did for climate, this convention could build the architecture for financial justice. And multilateralism is at the center of it. Without it being at the UN, all actors are not going to be at the table. So it is very important that we advocate to make sure this happens at the UN level. And next slide, please. Now, the challenges ahead, there will be resistance. Some fear loss of sovereignty. Private creditors fear accountability. Negotiations will be complex, but compromise is only legitimate when everyone is at the table. Multilateralism may be slow, but unilateralism is unjust. The real danger is not that multilateralism fails. It is that we accept the status quo. So, and next slide, please. What can Canada do in this space? Middle powers like Canada can help bridge the divide between North and South, debtors and creditors. Canada can champion the UN Framework Convention process, use its G20 and Paris Club positions to push for reform, pass anti-holdout legislation to protect debtor nations, promote climate-resilient debt clauses and debt for nature swaps. And finally, fund UNCTAD and UNDESA to strengthen global debt governance. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the UN80 initiative. There's going to be heavy streamlining across the UN with regard to staff, with regard to investments, with regard to resources, because of all the challenges that the UN is facing. It is important that funding is crucial, and Canada as a developed country can make this happen. Canada's reputation for constructive multilateralism, from peacekeeping to global health, can now extend to debt justice. I want to remind you of an initiative that happened at the height of COVID. We call it, as NGOs call it, as the Canada-Jamaica Initiative, but it's got a formal name, Financing for the Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond Initiative. I'll share the link in the chat. Read about it. It was initiated by two governments, Canada and Jamaica. Right at the height of COVID, these countries came together to initiate a series of actions at the UN. And I would like to argue that these discussions really set the path for the summit of the future. It set the path for the FFD4. It really defined a lot of conversations that came after that. So it's important that we look at such engagements at the UN that have happened, and where Canada has spearheaded it. And it's really led into a series of actions that are helping us right now. So also ensuring, and it's also Canada can also ensure the effective implementation of the Serie outcome that came from the Financing for Development Conference. Commitment to fair and timely debt restructuring. Secondly, UN-led coordination and guiding principle. The outcome document requested the UN Secretary General, together with the IMF and World Bank, to propose voluntary guiding principles on responsible sovereign borrowing and lending, and explore ways to close gaps in global debt architecture. So this is an area, there's already commitments to do this. And so Canada, as a government who is a member of the United Nations and a powerful member of the United Nations, can push for this. And innovative tools of resilience, as we already mentioned, the global debt registry, the state contingent lending instruments such as climate resilient debt clauses to improve transparency and adaptability. And recognition, but limited ambition. While acknowledging the debt crisis and calling for inclusion of all creditors, the Serie outcome stops short of endorsing a binding multilateral mechanism, reflecting political resistance from major creditor nations. So just to look at that, it's also important to build bridges. I'm guessing the Jubilee campaign is global. It's just not limited to campaign. Tap into that capacity and the power you have across the globe, really to move with your feet to strengthen advocacy. And I'd like to close now the last slide. Thank you. And I just close with these lines. The debt system we have built mirrors our world, unequal, opaque, and fragmented. Multilateralism mirrors the world we aspire to build, cooperative, sustainable, and just. A UN Framework Convention on debt will not solve every crisis overnight, but it can change the operating system itself. From discretion to rules, from charity to justice, from secrecy to transparency. This is not only an economic reform, it is a moral renewal. And there was a quote that it was inspired by Kofi Annan, and it has been posted several times on UN websites and so forth. And I'd like to mention it in my closing: multilateralism in solidarity made operational. So let us make that solidarity real by giving the world fair, transparent, and binding system for sovereign debt. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation, and look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you so much. Whew, yeah. I think we can all take a moment to applaud. That's amazing. I see we have one question in the chat. And I have some questions as well. So I invite others to please include their questions in the chat as we ponder this incredible call for moral renewal, which we so desperately need right now, and solidarity made operational again. So we have one question from Paul, which is, what percentage of debt is country to country and the percentage of country to corporation? That's one. I have a follow-up question to that. I'm curious about which countries are the major debtors and also which corporations are the major debtors. I mean, which corporations have the kind of resources to do that? So that's one for you both. And we invite others to add their questions in the chat as well. I don't know if Anita or Daniela, if either one of you would like to take that.
I can just simply say that, bilateral country-to-country creditors are on 28 to 30%. Paris Club members such as France, Japan, UK, 10 to 12%. And then there are emerging creditors, especially China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, etc., at around 18%. And then the private creditors is bondholders, sovereign bond issued in global markets. It's around 35 to 40%. And then commercial bank and other private lenders around 15%. Now, these are not the exact numbers, but I had jotted these down, so hopefully that's helpful.
Oh, that's very helpful. That's fascinating. It's fascinating to see how it plays out percentage-wise, and deeply, deeply concerning as well in terms of how we hold people to account. We have another, I'm thinking corporations more so. We have another question.
If I may just add one more point. In 2024, developing countries' total external debt was around $9.1 trillion and about $4.5 trillion to private creditors, about 4.6 trillion to official creditors. So bilateral plus multilateral. These numbers are very scary, but that's the reality, right? And
just before we get to our next question, do we know how much is given or shared, whatever language we want to use, in bilateral development aid, for example, by comparison? Anyhow, I can research that global number.
Yes, yeah. I think, especially with the global registry, this would be very helpful, because many times between bilateral credit, and Daniela, you can correct me on this, it's not public information, right? It's not publicly listed. And so it's very difficult to assess exactly how much is being, transferred. How much do they owe? Because even the interest rates keep adding up, right? Because they are all pegged to the US dollar in many cases. And so there is a bigger challenge. So I'm not sure exactly the number. I don't want to give you a number that could be wrong, but yeah.
I'm just curious how it seems that development aid can make sense, but the debt relief doesn't, right? There seems to be there seems to be some kind of not moral supremacy, but a sense of doing good in providing development aid, and a different sense around debt relief. But anyhow, I will go to our questions. Who is in charge of organizing this sovereign debt framework? That's from Susanna.
I want to add just a brief comment on the data before you were sharing.
Yes, please.
It's a bit different when you look only to low-income and middle-income countries. But the thing I want to highlight here is that in 2000, more or less, we have had a bigger share of bilateral creditors in the composition of the debt, and now we're seeing a greater share of these private creditors as a whole. Most of them, of course, bondholders. So that's, I think, one of the key issues why the debt renegotiations are coming more and more complex. And the other thing, when you were saying who is behind these private creditors, there's a huge share of BlackRock at the end, but it's difficult to follow up on who is the last holder of that debt, because sometimes these bonds are sell in the second market, so it's difficult to follow up on that. But yeah, that's one key. It's a key question because that's one of the aspects that make today debt more challenging than before. And yeah, perhaps I would change to Spanish because I want to highlight one thing that related to the principles that also were asked in the chat that should guide this framework convention. Turning to Spanish. Hay dos principios adicionales.
The two principles that are addition to the ones that I am reading in the chat that I would like to share that are very important. And there's one which is with responsibility and justice. Why I'm saying responsibility, shared responsibility, but I think in the world, all of us, we elect authorities hoping that their decisions will represent us and will guarantee our best well-being in a world that has been shared or just common to everyone. I think that there's a very important issue there. So with the condition which is related to guaranteeing a dignified life. I think dignity is very important, and justice in the final on that. Like looking for it is not another imbalance of power, but that the results be just for everybody who's involved, and that we could have better for everyone. And so that, and if you allow me, what's the last question? Was who's in charge? And so that I was saying, Anita, within this compromiso de Sevilla and that framework, there are some agreements that open some windows of opportunity to start up with these reforms. As one of the agreements is to start an intergovernmental process in the United Nations, the institution that could start to have leadership within this framework for the debt is the United Nations. But if they don't have the support of the member states, it won't be possible. So what we need is political will, and it would be very important to say, as Anita was suggesting, leadership of countries, for example, Canada, and if some of the countries start pushing this forward, then we could see things advancing.
And so if I may also add, there was a question there. Thank you for referring to that, Daniela. And also I may just add to the question on who is in charge, is it, of organizing the sovereign debt framework? When you talk about organizing the same work, or who is in charge of the current sovereign debt framework, right? And the way it's the International Monetary Fund has placed a central role. The IMF, it determines whether a country's debt is sustainable, a key step before any restructuring can begin. And we've also asked this question to the IMF, like many times we hear that the austerity measures, this was also discussed as the most recent IMF World Bank meetings, the austerity measures that happen at a country level. When a country is
asked to restructure its debt, many times the country also comes back and sort of takes austerity measures because it's trying to a great extent, ensure that it can make its debt payment. And what can it cut? The most easiest thing is to cut social protection, right? Public goods. And so it's very important to look at both angles and make sure that when a new government comes into place, that it doesn't build on what was already agreed upon in the previous government when it comes to addressing investing in public goods, right? And austerity should not be a solution. With the World Bank and other multilateral banks, they provide long-term development loans and increasingly climate finance. So there are, as we already discussed, the G20 and the Paris Club. And as well as, these are some of the private creditors that we talked about, right? And so they are all part of this. It's not equal, but it seems at the top of it is the IMF is the one that is providing the direction. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. Are there any, and I'm thinking again for our advocacy, so, using our feet and our hands to actually push this forward. Are there any countries who are pushing at the UN for a framework, a UN framework convention on sovereign debt?
I would, based on all the discussions that happened in the lead up to the FFD4 outcome document, G77 countries can be a great ally because that's where because those are some of the countries that are heavily impacted by debt, right? And so Daniela, you wanna, since you're on top of it, maybe you wanna share a bit more on that, yeah.
Yes, we were also following on the process towards FFD4. During the negotiations, we saw support from some global south regions that were vocal specifically on the UN Debt Framework Convention on Debt, that are Egypt, Pakistan, Cuba, Brazil, and I'm forgetting, and at the end, the African Union. So I think this group of countries from the global south can lead on this. We saw opposition from the European Union mainly, but also from other countries of advanced economies. And I think the G77 could play a key role, but at the moment in debt issues, perhaps the problem could be that China is also creditor. So that's, I think, where there's a bit of difficulty to holding a unique position on this matter.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a particular challenge. We have a question here from Susan around how do we help people make the leap to understand the importance of this debt issue?
I had shared this with Tanya and Beth earlier. Some of the initiatives that happen in Canada, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, the digital bank, central bank digital currencies. And Canada, each country, there's a lot of conversations on adopting a central bank digital currency. And Canada, I understand based on my research that they had done focus groups with citizens on whether Canada should promote a central bank digital currency. And at the end of it, it was decided not to pursue it. So it's important. I think this came from citizens, that request from citizens, right? To have that open conversation. So it is important to raise awareness, such as the Jubilee, this campaign that you are organizing. And these webinars should be shared in other venues, just not only in the debt discussions, but in other venues and, in churches and in community organizations, and build partnership with organizations, with women's organizations, indigenous communities, because it has an impact on everybody. And try to get in front of legislatures. I wanted to share this example when Tanya had mentioned in her introduction that we have this ILO Convention C190. It's a coalition of 5 NGO committees in New York, which I initiated. Our goal, we came together because we felt that it was important to ensure a safe and decent work environment for everyone. And the interlinkage of that to the economy as a whole, or to social development, to climate, is all there. So we need to look at how debt is having interlinkages with other aspects of the discussions that are happening, and try to bring it into venues that you normally may not think is important, right? And really have partners from other spaces to really promote the agenda that you have to strengthen advocacy.
That's really, really interesting to think about how we bring it into other spaces, but also how we connect it to other issues so that it moves it as this standalone, which seems impossible. And there's a question which in some ways speaks to that, or is somewhat addressed by what you just shared, and that is some of the feedback we hear in Canada is creating a UN framework, and this has to be our last question because as much as I could talk about this forever, we are nearing the end of our time together. So creating a UN framework would be difficult to do. What would your response to that be as we approach the Canadian government?
I would look at the example of the climate agreements as to how that transpired, because everybody came on the table, right? We would also look at what some of the immediate action items, look at the Sevilla outcome and see what the immediate actions that are recommended, because that was the government committed to that. Right. It's also important to look at the summit of the future. Out of the summit of the future, there is the global the compact for the future. In that, there was a request for setting up, the global financial architecture. So there are discussions that are happening in multiple areas. Try to interlink all of that and ensure that your conversation, because these are also spaces where Canada is very active, right? And try to bring that into this discussion. It may not be the framework right away. It's going to be a long process, but stepping stones. What are the low-hanging fruits in this space? Try to, the call for a working group between the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank. How is that playing out? Is that really taking action? Right? Is that coming into fruition? So, my recommendation would be look at the Sevilla outcome and see what the commitments. I would also request that there are 139, they're called SPAs. These are commitments that were made coming out of the Sevilla platform for action. So look at that and see whether there are any that speak to debt. And if there are countries that have made specific commitments in that space, the sovereign debt reform, maybe those are the countries that you could partner with.
Thank you.
Just to add, well, first, a message from me that is the biggest changes, I think, were never easy. So not because it's difficult, we will stop. And I think we're an interdependent nations in a world that is more connected than ever. So I think if we want a better world, we need to act together, and that's another key message. And I think, as Anita was saying, to look at this Sevilla platform of action, for action, there are two advancements, and today was launched one of them, that is the Sevilla Forum. And it's not binding, it's nothing related to that, but there will be a space for open dialogue between all countries on sovereign debt issues. And they are planning to hold annual meetings in Sevilla, and the first task they will try to do is to work on these responsible lending and borrowing principles. So I think, as Anita was saying, perhaps Canada can partner with Spain or other countries in this regard. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much. As I said, I really could sit here for another hour, but I do need to hand it over to Beth in one moment after I thank our absolutely incredible speakers. I really appreciate your expertise, your insight, and this analysis. I think it has certainly given me much to think about, and I'm feeling very, very energized and ready to take action. But before we move there and talk about what we can do next and how inspired we are to act, I do want to hand it over to my colleague Beth, who is going to talk to you about an evaluation of our webinar series. Sorry, Beth, after that.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Tanya. And thank you to everyone for your participation tonight. And if you joined us for the first and second session, thank you for joining us throughout this series. We value your feedback, and so please take a few moments to complete the brief evaluation form. I'm going to put the link in the chat, and you can fill it out while you listen to Tanya share about next steps. We will also send out the link in the follow-up email. So if you don't have a chance to fill it out tonight, there will be a chance to fill it out again. And it's only 5 questions. So please take a few moments to let us know about the series and how we can learn and grow together. Thanks so much.
All right, next steps. We certainly heard some areas for exploration and follow-up. I will definitely be looking at the Sevilla platform for action, 139 spas, as they were called. Is that right? But there are some immediate things that all of you can do, our network and members who have joined us. Of course, one of the easy ways in which you can act is through our Jubilee campaign, which has brought us all together tonight. We are very grateful that so many of you have already added your voice to the Jubilee petition. We are almost halfway to our goal. So your commitment is helping us to move this campaign forward. If you have not already done so, please sign the petition. I think my colleagues are adding this information in the chat. Powerful next step for the Jubilee campaign is also to invite others in your community to sign as well. So our goal is 100,000 signatures for Canada in 2025, and your outreach can help us get there. By the end of this year, we'll take our 100,000 signatures and plan our advocacy efforts for 2026. So there is still how many months? November, December. We have 2.5 months left to collect the remaining signatures. So here are a few ways that you can help us get to 100,000. Share the petition on your social media and in your community newsletters. We have an amplification tool for template messaging to help you. We also have an animator's toolkit for paper petitions that you can print out and with worship resources, graphics, and more. And these can help you invite others to take action. Other ways to amplify the Jubilee 2025 campaign, we have the Proclaim Jubilee Initiative, which launched a few weeks ago, and it will run until November 10th. It was timed to coincide with the 2025 World Bank Group and IMF annual meetings, which were held last week in Washington, D.C., and it will run until the start of the UN Climate Change Conference, so COP30, which is happening on November 10th. Participation in Proclaim Jubilee is simple. All you need is a group of people and some way to include a horn. Please visit the link for more information. You can, from November 14th to 16th, we also have the Global Weekend of Action for Climate Justice, which is timed for the middle weekend of COP30. And this members can gather members in your community for a Candles for COP Vigil or a Jubilee Walk for climate and debt justice. And For the Love of Creation invites groups across Canada to host candlelight vigils in their own communities on the weekend of November 14th to 16th. This will be a time to reflect and share our love for our planet and to share hopes for truly transformative action to happen at COP. It's an excellent opportunity to also invite people to sign the petition. In that same weekend, Development and Peace Caritas Canada invites you to organize a walk in your community to show solidarity with people living in countries in the global south that are facing the impacts of debt crisis. If you're interested in following the Jubilee conversation at COP30 and want to be part of the For the Love of Creation Animators Circle, please visit the For the Love of Creation website for more details. And with that, I want to thank everyone again for joining us. Oh, fresh off the press, we have our Kairos companion to Jubilee, Faith, Justice, and Right Relationships. That came out of my absence since I haven't been in the office today. Congratulations, team. Please visit the resource and use it with your communities. Thanks so much. Thanks again to our speakers, Daniela and Anita. It really has been an inspiring evening. I very much appreciate your wisdom and your insight and your push to get us thinking more and differently about how to engage our own government to take the kind of moral leadership that we all so desperately need at this particular moment, and that we can make a different design choice. I loved that the design of the system as it is, that was a choice. We can make a different choice with new moral leadership or courageous moral leadership. So on that note, thank you so much, everyone. It has been an absolute pleasure. I do hope to see everyone again soon from our network. And Daniela and Anita, I wish you well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela. Gracias.
A ti.
Thank you, Beth.
Bye bye.
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye. Good night. Bye-bye.